June 6, 1944. The Allies launch Operation Overlord, better known as the Battle of Normandy, and begin the liberation of Europe. The days of Nazism are numbered, and the final chapter of the brutal war will soon arrive. The memory of the naval landing on the French coast has been engraved in the memory of the entire world. But what is not known is that that mission could not have been carried out without the huge airborne invasion that paved the way. On this occasion, we will focus on that part of the events, and particularly on the odyssey that the 517th Parachute Regiment of the United States went through. From its violent landing on European soil to the fierce clashes with the Germans on the way to Berlin to finish off Adolf Hitler. If you want to relive all the action in which these troops participated, then stay with us, because we are about to go through a new page of military history. Planning for D-Day was unprecedented in scale and complexity. The Germans had occupied France 4 years earlier, in June 1940, and despite the efforts of the resistance, the Nazis had the capabilities to control the country without much effort. For this reason, the operation called for American, British, and Canadian divisions to land on 5 beaches, covering approximately 95 kilometers of coastline in the Normandy region. However, those in charge of putting together the plan determined that an amphibious assault alone would not be enough, and that is why the airborne regiments were an important part of the mission. Their role was to seize several roads behind the coast, to prevent the Germans from reinforcing the coastal defenses, and to create the conditions for the advance of the Allied troops. The participation of these soldiers began on the night of June 5th, during the hours before the landing. More than 13,000 American paratroopers boarded C-47s for the largest airborne operation in history. However, trouble began when they crossed into France and encountered a cloud bank over the Cotentin Peninsula. Because of this, most of the pilots climbed or dived, but that was not the only obstacle, as they soon encountered a destructive burst of anti-aircraft fire that forced the fleet to disperse. In the resulting chaos, the crews bailed out of their aircraft, far from their intended location. Most of the airborne soldiers landed without any idea of where they were. In the darkness, the men of these divisions mingled and fought dozens of small battles across a vast territory as they advanced through the French countryside. Confused by the number of open fronts, the Germans wasted time trying to decide where to direct their counterattacks, and that contributed to the Allies' ultimate objective. The flashes of rifles illuminated the darkness before the sun rose in the sky. Screams and moans of pain were camouflaged among the sound of gunfire, and blood was pouring out from everywhere. That moment was truly brutal, where the enemy soldiers saw each other face to face and only thought of killing before being killed. In any case, this was not a one-day operation, and in fact, to know the fate of our protagonists, we must advance to August 15th, 1944, when the forces determined to end the Nazi occupation carried out another landing, but this time in Provence. The first attack had been from the north with the deployment in Normandy, and while a brutal battle broke out to force the soldiers of the Third Reich to retreat, the new offensive came from the south to corner them and make the Axis troops divide, relieving the pressure in Normandy. At 8 a.m. that day, the U.S. 517th Parachute Regiment arrived in France with 2,500 men aboard 180 C-47 aircraft and was greeted by the violent scene of war. Beyond the hostile welcome, this was not an unfamiliar scenario for this airborne division that had been created in March 1943, specifically to be part of the combat during World War II. The parachute units were formed with volunteers who were selected and trained at Camp Takua in the mountains of northeast Georgia, United States. After preparation, the team traveled to its first deployment in a key overseas point, Italy. The 517th Parachute Regiment moved by ship and arrived at the port of Naples on May 31, 1944. Upon arrival, the soldiers walked down the gangplanks to the waiting train cars and were transferred to the suburbs of Bagnoli, where they were ready for the attack from Valmontone to Rome the next day. The troops were ready to go, but since the weapons, artillery, and crew vehicles had been loaded separately, they would have to operate only with rifles. This complicated the mission, which ended up being canceled. The soldiers set up camp in the crater, a place located inside an inactive volcano, in the hope of staying hidden, and they remained there until June 14. They had already received their equipment, were armed and prepared for action in a new Italian destination to which they had been assigned, Civitavecchia. During their first engagement, they suffered between 40 and 50 casualties, but managed to inflict many more on their rivals. Over the next 7 days, they maintained a continuous advance, where the Germans tried to carry out a retreat, but were caught by force. The American deployment was a success and allowed them to continue on their way to other towns where enemy troops were concentrated. This is how they reached the hilltop village of Montesarchio, which ended up being captured by the Americans. Later, they moved through Montepascali against slight resistance and continued on until they took Sticiano, managing to capture 14 Axis prisoners. The conquest continued to accumulate until the end of June, when the 517th Parachute Regiment was put into reserve. At that time, a new destination arose in their path. Provence awaited them. This is how we returned to French lands, where the airborne unit was part of the landing in the Mediterranean region that was named Operation Dragoon. The launch from the planes was the first challenge faced by the soldiers due to the bad weather that accompanied the scene. However, that was only the beginning, since the dispersal suffered by the troops was not exactly a matter of life or death. What could truly be lethal was the fierce German resistance that awaited them on the ground. The landing in Provence had a key strategic objective, which was to establish a second front in Western Europe, to create problems for the Nazis, who already had to deal with the battle in Normandy, decimating their forces. However, the mission did not end there. The Allies also sought to secure the ports of Toulon and Marseille to facilitate the entry of supplies and troops in support of operations against Adolf Hitler's Third Reich. Finally, the attrition of the enemy was the last point on the list, since by forcing the Germans to divide to face 2 attacks, the amount of resources for each combat would be less. This would allow them to be closer to a victory on French soil and begin to advance towards Berlin for the Führer's head. Before continuing, we give special thanks to our sponsor of this video, Vexorabet, the safest and most trusted destination for online casino games, where you will receive a 100% bonus on your first deposit, so you can double your chances of winning while having fun with the wide range of games available. In addition, you will have all the facilities to deposit and withdraw your winnings in real time. Access all the benefits and rewards with the link in the description and comments. Now let's continue with the video. The 517th Parachute Regiment was also accompanied by other American, British, and French units that participated in the operation, dropping from the skies into strategic areas where they had to secure key points and disorganize the Nazi defenses. Their objectives were bridges, roads, and positions in the German rearguard, which would facilitate the advance of the ground troops made up of the 7th United States Army that would arrive through an amphibious landing. Despite the initial resistance, the American unit managed to overcome the battle against the enemy. Small groups that managed to unite after dispersing upon landing were able to cause great damage to Hitler's forces and quickly ventured into the interior of Provence. On August 27th, they secured Toulon, and a day later, Marseille. Gunfire multiplied in every corner of the cities, indicating that the Allies were approaching, and those who had occupied the territory of France were slowly falling. By September, almost the entire region was already under the control of the forces of the United States and its partners. Operation Dragoon resulted in the liberation of a large part of the south of the country from German rule, facilitating the connection with the forces advancing from the north. The recovered ports also became vital for the supply of troops and the continuation of missions on the Western Front. However, despite the fact that the enemy had also been weakened, the road was still long towards the capital of the Third Reich, and many obstacles awaited the 571st Regiment on the journey, threatening the lives of the brave soldiers.
Il est parti.
Yeah, I think he's gone.
Leaving Provence behind, the paratrooper unit had lost 19 men and 126 wounded, but they had no plans to stop. They continued onward, leaving their mark across southern France in the Allied advance. In particular, the 517th Regiment faced small battles in every town they passed through. One of these was in Monaco, where they liberated the town from the few remaining Germans after a naval bombardment. They also worked to strengthen defensive positions in and around Paracava. They built trenches and prepared a 24-kilometer front to prevent a German counteroffensive. Although the place was poorly manned by Allied troops, they managed to use mines and other explosive traps to compensate for the lack of men. However, the brutality of the war brought more casualties to the unit, which ended its participation in the region on November 17, 1944, with 102 soldiers killed in action. However, it would not be long before this team returned to the field. The U.S. 517th Parachute Regiment, which had been placed in reserve in the city of Soissons, already in the northern region of France, was called to participate in the Battle of the Bulge, when the Allies were overwhelmed by the fierce and last great offensive of the German army during World War II. The confrontation had begun on December 16, 1944, and took place in the area of extensive forests and hills that covers parts of France, Belgium, and Luxembourg. The peculiarity of the Nazi attack was that their rivals were taken totally by surprise, and Hitler's troops advanced on the weakest positions of the Americans. At a disadvantage, the Airborne Corps arrived as reinforcements 5 days after the German attack, acted quickly, and soon joined the fighting. The Nazi armor had made the situation difficult to control. It was impossible to determine exactly where the enemy front began under tank fire, and the main objective of the Americans was to withdraw their rivals from the high ground that gave them a strategic advantage. The task became almost impossible, and to avoid a high number of casualties from the attack of tanks and automatic weapons, Uncle Sam's troops had to opt for Plan B and take another route to go around the area. Even so, it was not easy to advance through the battlefield, and it was necessary to fight for every inch of ground along their route.
Go left! Go left!
The SS Panzer Corps, the Nazi armored unit, achieved some conquests in the fierce fighting, causing shock in the Allied command. The fall of the city of Mannheim in Belgium during Christmas was one of the great impacts. The German forces now had a base from which they could advance northwards, towards Liège. Suddenly, the Third Reich, which seemed defeated, was filled with hopes of once again conquering territory. This situation generated concern in its rivals, and the need to act to recover that strategic place that had been lost in the fighting. The Allied authorities ordered to go for Mannheim, and the 517th Regiment was one of those chosen for such a mission, joining the 7th Armored Division to fall with all the American power on the Germans. The unit would have to cross just over 3 kilometers of terrain, covered in snow and undergrowth in the dark, before reaching the starting line for the operation. The attack would begin at 2:15 a.m. on December 26th, after a 10-minute bombardment by 8 artillery battalions. Everything was ready, and the offensive proceeded as planned, after 5,000 rounds of shells were fired. By 3:30 a.m., every last pocket of resistance had been eliminated. A light counterattack was repulsed half an hour later, and the objective was finally achieved. With the confidence that had been gained by recovering the city of Mannheim, the following days were positive for the Allies, and the 517 Regiment led different attacks towards the south in the zone of France. The Nazis refused to surrender and fought with great brutality until the last moment, causing casualties in the American and French forces that accompanied them. The heat of war was met with extremely low temperatures in January 1945. This meant that weapons required maintenance, and the engines of trucks and armored vehicles had to be started every half hour to prevent fuel from freezing. However, although some attacks were suspended due to snowstorms, the offensive continued on both sides. The American advance in the south was taking place at a rate of 1 kilometer per day, with the 517th Regiment taking the lead. The majority of the German forces began to execute a successful retreat, fighting long enough to escape the battle zone. Even a large part of the armored vehicles were abandoned in order to prioritize the lives of the soldiers. On 7th January 1945, Hitler agreed to the return of all forces that had been sent to the Ardennes, thus ending the offensive operations of the Third Reich. However, heavy fighting continued for about another 3 weeks, and the last German units involved in the fighting did not return to their original line until 25th January. After those clashes, World War II began to turn decisively in favor of the Allies. However, the Nazi resistance was still to generate some brutal battles on the road to Berlin. One of them was the fight that took place in the town of Schmidt, where the 517th Parachute Regiment of the United States was to advance to the Kleinau-Bergstein area to relieve the elements of the 8th Infantry Division and attack south during the darkness of February 5th to seize a hill on which the Germans had prepared strong defenses. After dark, the unit moved into attack position. At 500 or 600 meters from the objective, they encountered minefields and barbed wire. The soldiers tried to advance by crawling and groping in the darkness, but all efforts were useless. The men were blown into the air by the explosives. Later, with support, a new attempt to reach the Third Reich positions was thwarted by fierce machine gun fire, and the same scene was repeated twice more until the 517th Regiment was relieved by the 508th Infantry Regiment. After that experience, the paratrooper team was transported by truck to the train station in Aachen, Germany. After a 2-day train ride, it reached Laon in French territory, where it stayed for a few days. Finally, on February 15th, the 18th Airborne Corps notified the unit that it had been assigned to a newly arrived division and was to travel to Joigny, 110 kilometers from Paris. Among the plans contemplated for these soldiers was Operation Varsity, which involved an airborne crossing of the Rhine River, and Operation Coronet, the airborne invasion of the Japanese islands. However, it never reached its destination, as on 21 February 1945, while traveling to Joigny, the 517th Parachute Regiment was disbanded. Despite never seeing action again, the unit was formally deactivated in 1946, just 33 months after its creation. However, despite its relatively short life, members of this parachute combat team received a Medal of Honor, 6 Distinguished Service Crosses, 5 Legions of Merit, 131 Silver Stars, 631 Bronze Stars, 2 Air Medals, 4 Soldiers' Medals, 17 French Croix de Guerre, and 1,576 Purple Hearts, at the cost of 252 officers and men killed in action. Now, after having met the glorious 517th Parachute Regiment of the United States that fought in the offensive that launched the victory during World War II, the time has come to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having accompanied us until the end. We hope to see you again in our next video.